Athens, 306 BCE. While the great city-state convulses with political upheaval and military defeat, while empires rise and fall across the Mediterranean world, a quiet revolution unfolds behind the walls of an unremarkable house on the outskirts of the city. Here, in what its inhabitants simply call the garden, a middle-aged philosopher tends to vegetables, shares simple meals with friends, and teaches a way of life so radical in its simplicity that it will be misunderstood for over 2 millennia. Epicurus sits in dappled sunlight beneath an olive tree, a man of 45, whose face bears the calm contentment of someone who has solved life's deepest puzzle. Around him gather his companions, men and women, slaves and free citizens, young students and elderly seekers, all drawn by his promise that genuine happiness is not only possible, but surprisingly easy to achieve. The scene appears unremarkable, friends sharing bread, olives, and water, their conversation punctuated by gentle laughter and thoughtful silences. Yet this moment represents one of history's most profound philosophical breakthroughs. Epicurus has discovered something that eludes most human beings throughout their lives: the secret of being truly content. Not the fleeting pleasure of momentary satisfaction, not the anxious pursuit of status and wealth that consumes his fellow Athenians, but a deep, unshakable peace that comes from understanding what actually matters and letting go of what does not. The irony is profound. While merchants race through Athens' agora chasing profits, while politicians scheme for power, while generals march armies across distant lands in pursuit of glory, the man who has unlocked the mystery of human happiness grows lettuce, cherishes friendships, and finds infinite pleasure in a cup of water when he is thirsty. He has learned that the greatest riches come not from having more but from needing less, that the deepest security comes not from external achievements, but from internal understanding. This is not the philosophy of withdrawal or defeat that his critics will claim. This is the most practical wisdom ever developed, a systematic understanding of how consciousness works, what brings genuine satisfaction, and how to construct a life immune to the anxieties and disappointments that make most people miserable. Epicurus has discovered that pleasure properly understood is indeed the highest good, but that the highest pleasures are the simplest ones, available to anyone willing to learn what they actually need for happiness. The garden itself embodies his revolutionary insights. Unlike other philosophical schools that focus on abstract theoretical debates, this community demonstrates practical wisdom through daily living. Its members have learned to distinguish between natural and necessary desires like food, shelter, and friendship, and empty desires manufactured by social pressure and internal confusion. They have discovered that most human suffering comes not from external circumstances, but from false beliefs about what will make them happy. Consider the audacity of what he is teaching. In a culture obsessed with honor, competition, and external validation, he argues that the good life requires withdrawing from public ambition to focus on private contentment. In a society that measures worth through wealth and status, he demonstrates that genuine prosperity comes from appreciating what one already has. In an age that seeks meaning through grand narratives about gods and fate, he offers the radical proposition that this life, this moment, this simple experience of being conscious, is sufficient. The conversations that unfold in the garden address the deepest human anxieties with startling directness. Fear of death. Epicurus explains why death cannot harm us, since we will not exist to experience it. Anxiety about the future. He teaches how to find security through understanding what we can and cannot control. Loneliness and isolation. The garden itself demonstrates how genuine friendship can provide the deepest satisfaction life offers. But perhaps most radically, he is proving that philosophical wisdom need not be the privilege of wealthy intellectuals or religious initiates. The truths he teaches are accessible to anyone willing to examine their own experience honestly and courageously. A slave can be happier than an emperor if the slave understands the nature of pleasure, while the emperor remains confused by false desires. A poor person can live more richly than a wealthy one if the poor person has learned what true wealth means. The afternoon light filters through the leaves as Epicurus shares a simple meal with his friends, demonstrating through his very presence that complete contentment is possible for finite beings embedded in an uncertain world. He has found something more precious than all the treasures that empires fight to possess: perfect peace of mind, based on clear understanding of what human beings actually need to flourish. To understand how this remarkable serenity emerged from a world of chaos and conflict, we must journey back to the island community where a young man first began to question whether the pursuit of conventional success might be the very thing that makes happiness impossible. The seeds of the most practical philosophy ever developed were planted on Samos, a prosperous island in the eastern Aegean Sea where trade winds carried not only goods and gold, but ideas that would challenge everything previous thinkers had assumed about the relationship between pleasure and virtue, individual happiness and social responsibility, philosophical wisdom and practical living. Epicurus was born on Samos in 341 BCE, into a family of Athenian colonists who had established themselves as part of the island's educated merchant class. His father, Neocles, was a teacher who had earned citizenship through military service to Athens. His mother, Charistrate, came from a family with interests in religious ritual and traditional healing practices. This combination exposed young Epicurus to both rational intellectual analysis and intuitive understanding of how beliefs and practices affected human well-being. The political situation of Samos during Epicurus's youth proved crucial to his intellectual development. The island existed in a state of constant uncertainty, its allegiances shifting between competing powers as the Greek world fragmented following the death of Alexander the Great. Athenian colonists, like the family of Epicurus, lived with the perpetual anxiety of potentially losing their property, citizenship, and social position, depending on the outcomes of distant political and military conflicts they could neither predict nor control. This environment of chronic insecurity created ideal conditions for developing philosophical insights about the relationship between external circumstances and internal peace. Young Epicurus observed that the people around him who were most anxious about political and economic developments were often those who had achieved the greatest conventional success. Wealthy merchants worried constantly about losing their fortunes, prominent citizens feared political persecution, and even successful teachers like his father lived with persistent uncertainty about their futures. More importantly, he began to notice that happiness seemed to have little correlation with external achievements. Some of the most contented people he knew were those who had learned to find satisfaction in simple pleasures, meaningful work, genuine friendships, beautiful natural surroundings that remained available regardless of political circumstances. Conversely, those who had based their identities on wealth, status, or political influence often seemed miserable despite their apparent success. His early education combined traditional Greek learning, mathematics, rhetoric, natural philosophy with exposure to newer philosophical movements that were questioning conventional assumptions about virtue, pleasure, and the good life. The atomistic theories of Democritus, which explained all natural phenomena through the interactions of indivisible particles according to natural laws, provided a materialistic framework that would deeply influence his mature philosophy. If human beings were entirely natural phenomena, then human happiness might also be understood through careful observation and rational analysis, rather than through appeals to divine authority or abstract metaphysical speculation. The religious dimensions of his upbringing also proved philosophically significant. His mother's involvement in traditional healing practices and religious rituals gave him first-hand experience of how beliefs about supernatural intervention affected people's psychological states. He observed that religious practices often provided genuine comfort and community support, but that they also created unnecessary fears about divine punishment and cosmic purposes that seemed designed to make people anxious rather than peaceful. More troubling was his growing awareness that much human suffering seemed to result from confusion about what would actually satisfy human needs versus what people thought they wanted based on social expectations or internal psychological compulsions. The wealthy merchants of Samos had achieved everything that conventional wisdom suggested should make them happy: financial security, social recognition, political influence, yet many of them seemed less content than simple farmers or craftspeople who possessed clear understanding of their actual needs and the means to satisfy them. These observations led to the philosophical questions that would occupy the rest of his life. What do human beings actually need to be happy? How can we distinguish between genuine and false desires? What role do social relationships play in individual well-being? How can philosophical understanding contribute to practical wisdom about how to live well? The intellectual ferment of the post-Alexandrian Greek world provided unprecedented opportunities for exploring these questions. Traditional city-state loyalties were breaking down, creating both anxiety and freedom as individuals found themselves forced to construct personal identities and ethical frameworks without the guidance of stable cultural authorities. The expansion of Greek culture across the Mediterranean world through Alexander's conquests had exposed Greek thinkers to diverse cultural approaches to fundamental questions about reality, morality, and human purpose. This historical moment created ideal conditions for developing philosophical approaches that focused on individual well-being rather than civic duty, personal peace rather than public honor, practical wisdom rather than abstract theoretical speculation. The breakdown of traditional social structures made it both necessary and possible for individuals to take responsibility for their own happiness rather than accepting their assigned roles within established hierarchies. By the time Epicurus reached young adulthood, he had developed both the analytical tools and the practical insights necessary for creating a comprehensive philosophy of human happiness based on careful observation of what actually works to produce contentment and what consistently led to frustration and anxiety. His experiences on Samos had taught him that genuine philosophical wisdom must be tested against lived experience rather than defended through logical argument alone. The young man who eventually left Samos to establish philosophical schools throughout the Greek world carried with him not abstract theories about pleasure and virtue, but practical knowledge about the conditions that supported human flourishing. He had learned that the deepest questions about how to live well could only be answered through careful attention to the actual experiences of real people seeking genuine happiness in an uncertain world. This empirical approach to philosophical questions would distinguish his mature teaching from all previous and most subsequent philosophical systems. Instead of beginning with theoretical assumptions about human nature or cosmic purpose, he would start with careful observation of what actually made people happy or miserable, and develop theoretical frameworks adequate to explain what he observed. This methodology would prove revolutionary in its implications for understanding pleasure, friendship, and the possibility of achieving lasting peace of mind. Chapter 1. The Young Seeker. The transition from adolescence to adulthood proved particularly challenging for Epicurus because his analytical temperament made him unable to accept the conventional paths to success that satisfied his peers. While other young men from prominent families focused on developing skills in rhetoric, politics, or military leadership that would enable them to achieve wealth and social recognition, Epicurus found himself increasingly skeptical about whether such achievements could provide the satisfaction they promised. His observations of successful adults in Samian society had convinced him that conventional markers of success often correlated with high levels of anxiety, interpersonal conflict, and existential dissatisfaction. Wealthy merchants lived in constant fear of economic reversals that might destroy their fortunes. Politicians spent their time managing enemies and competitors rather than pursuing activities they found intrinsically rewarding. Even successful military leaders seemed driven by insecurities that no external achievement could resolve. These observations led him to begin what would become a lifelong practice of careful self-examination aimed at understanding his own motivations, desires, and sources of satisfaction. Unlike the Socratic approach of questioning others about their beliefs and values, Epicurus focused primarily on analyzing his own experience to discover which activities and attitudes produced genuine contentment versus those that created anxiety, frustration, or emptiness. This introspective analysis revealed several insights that would become central to his mature philosophy. First, he discovered that his happiest moments were typically simple ones: conversations with friends who shared his intellectual interests, solitary walks in natural settings where he could think clearly, periods of creative work when he became completely absorbed in developing new ideas. These pleasures cost little money, required no social status, and remained available regardless of external circumstances. Conversely, his most anxious and unsatisfying experiences typically involved situations where he felt pressured to pursue goals that other people considered important, but that held no genuine appeal for him. Competitive social gatherings where success required impressing others, political discussions where participants seemed more interested in winning arguments than discovering truth, and economic activities focused on accumulating wealth rather than meeting actual needs, all of these left him feeling empty and disconnected from his authentic interests and values. More significantly, he began to recognize patterns in how different types of desires affected his psychological state. Some desires for food when hungry, rest when tired, companionship when lonely seemed natural and easily satisfied, producing genuine pleasure when fulfilled and disappearing once their objects were obtained. Others for social recognition, luxury goods, or experiences that would make him feel superior to others seemed artificially generated and impossible to satisfy permanently, creating chronic dissatisfaction that persisted regardless of external achievements. This distinction between natural and artificial desires would eventually become a cornerstone of his philosophical system, but during his youth, it functioned primarily as a practical tool for making decisions about how to spend his time and energy. He began experimenting with focusing his attention and efforts on satisfying natural desires, while gradually withdrawing from pursuits driven by artificial ones. The results of these experiments were remarkably positive. By simplifying his lifestyle, reducing his involvement in competitive social activities, and concentrating on relationships and activities that provided genuine satisfaction, he found that his overall level of contentment increased dramatically, even as his external achievements became less impressive by conventional standards. This personal transformation occurred within the context of his formal education in philosophy, which exposed him to the major theoretical frameworks that contemporary thinkers were using to address fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, and ethics. His studies in atomistic natural philosophy convinced him that human beings were entirely natural phenomena whose thoughts, emotions, and behaviors operated according to discoverable natural laws rather than mysterious supernatural forces. This materialistic understanding of human nature provided theoretical foundation for his empirical approach to philosophical questions. If consciousness was a natural phenomenon, then the conditions that promoted psychological well-being could be discovered through careful observation and rational analysis, rather than through appeals to religious authority or abstract metaphysical speculation. His encounter with earlier hedonistic philosophers like Aristippus provided intellectual precedent for treating pleasure as a legitimate philosophical concern, but he quickly recognized that their approaches lacked the analytical sophistication necessary for distinguishing between different types of pleasure and their relationships to lasting happiness. Simple hedonism that sought immediate gratification regardless of long-term consequences seemed as likely to produce misery as conventional approaches that ignored pleasure entirely in favor of abstract virtue or social duty. The philosophical framework he began developing during these years integrated insights from atomistic materialism with careful empirical analysis of his own and others' experiences of pleasure, pain, and contentment. This combination would eventually produce a systematic understanding of human happiness that was both theoretically sophisticated and practically useful for anyone seeking to live well. Perhaps most importantly, his youthful experiments with different approaches to living had convinced him that genuine philosophical wisdom must be tested through practical application, rather than merely defended through logical argument. The ideas he was developing about pleasure, desire, and the good life would only be valuable if they actually helped people achieve greater happiness and peace of mind. This conviction would shape every aspect of his mature philosophical career. Unlike academic philosophers who were content to develop theoretical systems without regard for their practical applications, Epicurus would always insist that philosophical insights were only valuable to the extent that they contributed to human flourishing. This practical orientation would make his philosophy uniquely accessible and useful for people seeking genuine wisdom about how to live well, rather than mere intellectual sophistication. Chapter 2. The Atomic Universe. Epicurus's encounter with the atomistic philosophy of Democritus during his early 20s provided the theoretical foundation that would support his practical insights about pleasure, friendship, and the good life. This materialistic understanding of reality, the idea that everything that exists is composed of indivisible particles moving through empty space according to natural laws, liberated him from traditional assumptions about divine intervention, supernatural purpose, and cosmic meaning that often made human happiness seem impossible or irrelevant. The elegance and explanatory power of atomic theory impressed him immediately. Instead of requiring complex theological explanations for natural phenomena, atomism explained everything through the interactions of simple particles according to mathematical principles that could be understood through rational investigation. Thunder was not Zeus's anger, but the collision of air masses. Disease was not divine punishment, but the disruption of natural bodily processes. Death was not passage to another realm, but simply the dissolution of the atomic structures that temporarily constituted individual consciousness. This naturalistic worldview had profound implications for understanding human psychology and the possibilities for human happiness. If human beings were entirely natural phenomena, then human emotions, desires, and satisfactions operated according to discoverable natural laws, rather than mysterious spiritual forces. This meant that the conditions for psychological well-being could be identified through careful observation and rational analysis, just like the conditions for physical health or effective agriculture. More importantly, atomistic materialism eliminated many of the fears and anxieties that made most people miserable. If there were no vindictive gods waiting to punish human enjoyment, then pleasure was not morally suspect, but simply a natural aspect of conscious experience that could be pursued intelligently and without guilt. If death was simply cessation, rather than passage to judgment in another realm, then much of the anxiety that poisoned human experience was based on false beliefs that could be corrected through clear thinking. The political implications were equally liberating. If there was no cosmic purpose that required human beings to fulfill particular social roles or pursue specific goals, then individuals were free to construct their own purposes based on their actual needs and authentic interests, rather than externally imposed expectations. This freedom created both opportunities and responsibilities that traditional societies had not acknowledged or encouraged. Epicurus's integration of atomistic theory with his empirical observations about pleasure and happiness produced insights that went far beyond what either approach could provide alone. The materialistic framework explained why certain experiences produced satisfaction while others led to frustration, but his careful analysis of different types of pleasure revealed psychological distinctions that pure materialism had not adequately addressed. He began to develop what would become his famous distinction between kinetic and katastematic pleasures, between active enjoyments that involved motion or change, and static satisfactions that involved the absence of pain or disturbance. Kinetic pleasures, like eating when hungry or sexual satisfaction, provided intense but temporary enjoyment that disappeared once the underlying need was satisfied. Katastematic pleasures, like the peace of mind that came from understanding one's situation clearly, or the security that emerged from genuine friendship, could be maintained indefinitely and actually increased through cultivation and practice. This analysis revealed why so many people remained dissatisfied despite achieving everything they thought they wanted. Most conventional approaches to happiness focused exclusively on kinetic pleasures, acquiring wealth, achieving status, experiencing novel sensations that provided temporary satisfaction but quickly faded and needed constant renewal. People trapped in this cycle found themselves working harder and harder to achieve less and less genuine satisfaction. The alternative was to focus primarily on katastematic pleasures that could provide lasting contentment without requiring constant external input. The peace of mind that came from understanding the nature of reality, the security that emerged from cultivating genuine friendships, the satisfaction that resulted from living according to one's authentic nature rather than social expectations. These static pleasures formed the foundation for a genuinely happy life. The atomistic framework also provided a sophisticated understanding of human mortality that eliminated much of the existential anxiety that poisoned most people's experience of life. Death was not a mysterious transition to another form of existence, but simply the natural dissolution of the atomic structures that temporarily constituted individual consciousness. Since consciousness required the continuation of these specific atomic arrangements, death necessarily involved the cessation of all experience, including the experience of being dead. This analysis led to Epicurus's famous dictum that death is nothing to us because we cannot be harmed by experiences we do not have. The fear of death that dominated so much human psychology was based on the conceptual error of imagining oneself experiencing the state of being dead, which was logically impossible. Once this error was corrected through clear thinking about the relationship between consciousness and material processes, much of the anxiety that made life miserable could simply dissolve. The practical applications of this theoretical framework proved remarkably wide-ranging. Understanding the atomic basis of natural phenomena reduced superstitious fears about supernatural intervention in daily life. Recognizing the material basis of consciousness provided tools for managing emotions and desires more effectively. Accepting the natural character of death eliminated much of the existential anxiety that prevented people from fully enjoying their finite existence. Perhaps most importantly, atomistic materialism provided intellectual foundation for the radical proposition that human happiness was both possible and morally legitimate. If human beings were natural phenomena embedded within natural reality, then their flourishing was as natural and valuable as the flourishing of any other aspect of reality. There was no cosmic purpose that required them to sacrifice their genuine well-being for abstract ideals or external authorities. This theoretical liberation created space for developing practical approaches to living that were based entirely on careful analysis of what actually promoted human flourishing, rather than what various religious, political, or philosophical authorities claimed should promote human flourishing. The combination of materialistic understanding with empirical investigation of pleasure and happiness would prove revolutionary in its implications for how human beings could understand themselves and construct meaningful lives. Chapter 3. The nature of pleasure. The development of Epicurus's systematic analysis of pleasure during his late 20s represented one of the most sophisticated attempts in ancient philosophy to understand the relationship between immediate experience and lasting happiness. Unlike crude hedonists who treated all pleasures as equally valuable, or moralistic philosophers who treated pleasure as inherently corrupting, Epicurus developed analytical tools for distinguishing between different types of enjoyment and their contributions to genuine human flourishing. His approach was characteristically empirical, based on careful observation of his own and others' experiences, rather than abstract theoretical assumptions about what pleasure should or should not involve. This methodology led to insights that were both practically useful and philosophically revolutionary, challenging conventional assumptions about the relationship between virtue and happiness, individual satisfaction and social responsibility, immediate gratification, and long-term well-being. The foundation of his analysis was the recognition that pleasure and pain were not mere psychological accidents, but fundamental aspects of how consciousness oriented itself toward beneficial and harmful experiences. Pleasure indicated conditions that supported life and flourishing, while pain signaled threats that needed to be avoided or corrected. This natural guidance system had evolved to help living beings navigate their environments effectively, making pleasure a reliable indicator of what genuinely contributed to well-being when properly understood and intelligently applied. However, Epicurus observed that human consciousness had developed complexities that could distort this natural guidance system, leading people to pursue experiences that provided immediate pleasure but long-term harm, or to avoid experiences that were temporarily unpleasant but ultimately beneficial. The capacity for memory, anticipation, and abstract thinking that made human consciousness so powerful could also create psychological conflicts that simpler organisms did not experience. This analysis led to his crucial distinction between different categories of desires and their relationships to sustainable happiness. Natural and necessary desires for food, shelter, companionship, and freedom from pain could be satisfied relatively easily and provided genuine contentment when fulfilled. Natural but unnecessary desires for luxury foods, elaborate housing, sexual variety, or recognition beyond what was needed for security could provide legitimate pleasure when available but created suffering when pursued compulsively or when their absence was experienced as deprivation. Most problematic were empty desires that were artificially created by social pressure, psychological confusion, or philosophical error. The desire for immortality, for example, was based on conceptual confusion about the nature of personal identity and the relationship between consciousness and death. The desire for unlimited wealth or power reflected misunderstanding about what actually provided security and satisfaction. These empty desires could never be satisfied because their objects were either impossible or inherently unsatisfying. The practical implications of this analysis were profound. Most human misery resulted not from the inability to satisfy genuine needs, but from confusion about what those needs actually were. People who understood the difference between natural and artificial desires could achieve remarkable contentment with relatively modest external resources, while those who remained confused about their authentic needs would find themselves perpetually dissatisfied regardless of their material achievements. This insight led to Epicurus's systematic investigation of the specific pleasures that provided the most reliable and lasting satisfaction. Intellectual pleasures, the enjoyment that came from understanding natural phenomena. Solving philosophical problems, or contemplating beautiful ideas, proved remarkably durable and immune to external interference. Unlike physical pleasures that required particular objects or circumstances, intellectual pleasures could be cultivated and maintained through mental discipline alone. The pleasures of friendship occupied a particularly important place in his analysis because they combined emotional satisfaction with practical security. Genuine friendship provided both immediate enjoyment through shared activities and long-term peace of mind through mutual support and understanding. Unlike romantic relationships that often involve jealousy, possessiveness, and emotional instability, or family relationships that were based on biological accident rather than chosen affinity, friendships could be selected and maintained according to criteria that promoted both individual happiness and social harmony. Perhaps most revolutionary was his analysis of the relationship between pleasure and virtue. Traditional moral philosophy had generally treated these as competing values, assuming that virtuous behavior required sacrificing immediate pleasure for abstract duty or long-term consequences. Epicurus argued instead that properly understood pleasure and genuine virtue were identical, since virtuous behavior was simply intelligent behavior aimed at maximizing authentic satisfaction while minimizing unnecessary suffering. This integration of hedonistic and ethical concerns resolved many of the psychological conflicts that made conventional morality so difficult to maintain consistently. Instead of fighting against natural desires in the name of duty, individuals could learn to align their behavior with their authentic interests. Properly understood, justice, courage, temperance, and wisdom were not arbitrary restrictions on natural impulses, but practical skills for achieving the most reliable and lasting pleasures available to human beings. The development of this analytical framework required years of careful observation, systematic thinking, and practical experimentation. Epicurus tested his theoretical insights against his own experience and that of his students, modifying and refining his understanding as empirical evidence accumulated. This process convinced him that philosophical wisdom was not merely intellectual achievement, but practical knowledge that could dramatically improve the quality of human experience. The pleasure theory that emerged from this investigation provided both theoretical foundation and practical guidance for constructing a genuinely satisfying life. Unlike abstract ethical systems that prescribed behavior based on external authorities, or simplistic hedonism that ignored the complexities of human psychology, Epicurean pleasure theory offered sophisticated tools for understanding and managing the relationship between immediate experience and lasting happiness. Most importantly, this analysis demonstrated that the highest human pleasures were accessible to anyone willing to undertake the intellectual and emotional work necessary for understanding their own nature and situation. Clearly, wealth, status, and other external advantages might provide additional opportunities for enjoyment, but they were not necessary for achieving the fundamental satisfaction that came from living according to reason, maintaining genuine friendships, and appreciating the simple fact of conscious existence within natural reality. Chapter 4. Founding the Garden. In 306 BCE, at the age of 35, Epicurus purchased a house with a large garden on the outskirts of Athens and established what would become the most famous philosophical community in ancient history. Unlike other philosophical schools that functioned primarily as academic institutions focused on theoretical debate, the garden was designed as a practical demonstration of how philosophical insights could be translated into daily life and social organization. The choice of location was significant. By establishing his school outside the city walls, Epicurus symbolically rejected the conventional assumption that philosophical wisdom required engagement with political affairs and public recognition. The garden offered an alternative to the competitive, anxiety-provoking environment of Athenian civic life, providing space for developing the kind of relationships and practices that actually contributed to human flourishing. The physical design of the garden reflected Epicurean principles about the relationship between environment and well-being. Simple but comfortable buildings provided shelter without unnecessary luxury. Productive gardens supplied fresh food while offering opportunities for peaceful labor that connected residents with natural processes. Common areas facilitated social interaction, while private spaces allowed for solitary reflection and study. Everything was arranged to support the basic human needs for security, beauty, meaningful work, and genuine community. Perhaps most revolutionary was the garden's social organization, which challenged fundamental assumptions about gender, class, and social hierarchy that structured ancient Greek society. Women participated fully in philosophical discussions and community leadership, including Epicurus's own companion Leontian, who wrote philosophical treatises that were respected by contemporary intellectuals. Slaves were treated as equals and could earn their freedom through philosophical development rather than financial payment. This radical egalitarianism was not based on abstract theoretical commitments to human equality, but on practical recognition that authentic friendship and genuine community could only develop among people who related to each other as individuals, rather than as representatives of social categories. The artificial barriers that separated people according to gender, wealth, or birth status interfered with the natural human capacity for mutual understanding and support. The daily routine of the garden demonstrated Epicurean insights about pleasure, work, and social relationship in practical application. Members shared responsibility for growing food, maintaining buildings, and managing the community's simple economy. This productive work provided both physical exercise and psychological satisfaction while ensuring that the community remained economically self-sufficient and independent of external political pressures. The intellectual life of the garden combined serious philosophical study with accessible discussion that made complex ideas available to people regardless of their formal educational background. Epicurus's teaching methods emphasize clarity and practical application rather than technical sophistication or competitive debate. Students learned not merely to understand philosophical theories, but to apply philosophical insights to their own lives in ways that produced genuine improvement in their experience. The community's approach to ritual and celebration reflected Epicurean understanding of the relationship between tradition and reason. Monthly gatherings commemorated Epicurus's birthday and other significant occasions. But these celebrations were designed to strengthen social bonds and express gratitude for life's simple pleasures, rather than to worship supernatural authorities or maintain arbitrary customs. The rituals served human needs rather than demanding human sacrifice for abstract purposes. Perhaps most importantly, the garden served as a laboratory for testing Epicurean insights about friendship as the foundation of human happiness. The relationships that developed within the community provided empirical evidence that genuine intimacy and mutual support were possible among people who shared philosophical understanding and commitment to each other's flourishing. These friendships proved more durable and satisfying than conventional social relationships based on family obligation, economic interest, or political alliance. The economic arrangements of the garden demonstrated practical alternatives to both the competitive individualism and the authoritarian collectivism that characterize most ancient societies. Members contributed according to their abilities and received according to their needs. But this sharing was voluntary and based on mutual affection rather than external compulsion. The community achieved remarkable prosperity and stability through cooperation rather than competition. The garden's reputation spread throughout the Greek world, as people heard about a philosophical community where happiness was not merely theorized, but actually achieved and sustained over time. Visitors came from distant cities to observe how Epicurean principles worked in practice, and many stayed to become permanent members or returned home to establish similar communities in their own regions. The success of the garden provided compelling evidence that philosophical wisdom could indeed contribute to practical improvements in human life, rather than remaining merely abstract intellectual exercise. The community demonstrated that people from diverse backgrounds could live together harmoniously when they understood their genuine needs and developed skills for satisfying those needs cooperatively rather than competitively. Critics attacked the garden for its withdrawal from public life and its inclusion of women and slaves in philosophical activities. But these attacks only confirmed that the community was indeed challenging fundamental assumptions about how human beings should relate to each other and what constituted a meaningful life. The garden's existence proved that alternatives to conventional social arrangements were not only possible, but could provide greater satisfaction and security than traditional approaches. The philosophical insights that Epicurus had developed through individual reflection and analysis were validated through their practical application in community life. The garden demonstrated that pleasure, properly understood, could indeed serve as the foundation for ethical behavior and social organization. Friendship could provide both emotional satisfaction and practical security. Simple living could offer greater contentment than luxury consumption. Philosophical understanding could contribute to genuine happiness rather than merely intellectual sophistication. Most significantly, the garden proved that human beings possessed the capacity for creating social institutions that supported rather than undermined individual flourishing. The community's success suggested that much human misery resulted not from inevitable conflicts between individual and social needs, but from poorly designed social arrangements that frustrated rather than facilitated natural human capacities for cooperation, creativity, and mutual care. Chapter 5. The Fourfold Medicine. During the mature period of his teaching, Epicurus developed what he called the tetrapharmakos of fourfold medicine for the anxieties that prevented most people from achieving genuine happiness. This systematic approach to addressing the deepest human fears represented the practical culmination of his philosophical analysis, offering specific remedies for the psychological ailments that made peace of mind seem impossible for ordinary people living in uncertain times. The first element of this philosophical medicine addressed the fear of the gods that dominated ancient consciousness and created chronic anxiety about divine punishment for human pleasure and independence. Unlike atheists who simply denied the existence of deities, Epicurus argued that gods existed but were perfectly happy beings who lived in a state of constant bliss, and therefore had no interest in punishing or rewarding human behavior. Divine beings who had achieved complete contentment would be no more inclined to interfere in human affairs than happy humans would be inclined to torture insects. This reconceptualization of divinity eliminated the psychological terror that poisoned most religious experience, while preserving the sense of cosmic beauty and wonder that made religious consciousness valuable. The gods served as models of the perfect happiness that human beings could approximate through philosophical wisdom, demonstrating that complete contentment was indeed possible for conscious beings who understood their own nature and lived according to reason rather than fear. The practical implications were profound. Once people understood that divine forces were not monitoring their behavior or plotting punishments for their enjoyments, they could pursue happiness without the guilt and anxiety that made pleasure seem dangerous or morally suspect. The natural guidance system of pleasure and pain could function properly without interference from artificial fears about supernatural consequences for following natural impulses intelligently. The second medicine addressed the fear of death that made most people unable to fully appreciate their finite existence. Epicurus's analysis of mortality as simply the dissolution of the atomic structures that constituted consciousness provided intellectual foundation for accepting death as natural rather than tragic. Since consciousness required the continuation of specific material arrangements, death necessarily involved the cessation of all experience, making it impossible to be harmed by being dead. This understanding eliminated the existential anxiety that prevented people from committing fully to life. Instead of treating earthly existence as merely a preparation for some other realm, or viewing mortality as a cosmic injustice that made life meaningless, individuals could appreciate the remarkable fact that consciousness was possible at all and focus their energy on making the most of whatever time was available to them. The death analysis also provided resources for grieving losses without being overwhelmed by them. The death of friends and loved ones was indeed a genuine loss that caused real pain, but this pain did not indicate that life itself was meaningless or that personal attachments were mistakes to be avoided. Grief was simply the price paid for having experienced the genuine pleasure of caring about other conscious beings, and this price was worth paying because the alternative, a life without deep connections, would be far less satisfying than a life that included both love and loss. The third medicine addressed anxiety about achieving the things we need for happiness. Epicurus's analysis of different types of desires provided practical guidance for distinguishing between genuine needs that could be satisfied relatively easily and artificial ones that created chronic dissatisfaction regardless of external achievements. Understanding this distinction enabled people to focus their limited time and energy on pursuing what would actually make them content, rather than chasing goals that promised satisfaction but delivered anxiety. The analysis revealed that most of what people considered necessary for happiness was actually unnecessary for genuine contentment. Simple food, basic shelter, meaningful work, and genuine friendship could provide all the satisfaction that human nature required, while luxury possessions, social status, and competitive achievements often interfered with rather than contributed to authentic well-being. This insight was particularly liberating for people whose circumstances made conventional success difficult or impossible. Slaves, women, foreigners, and others who were excluded from traditional paths to social recognition could achieve genuine happiness through understanding and pursuing their authentic needs, while wealthy and powerful people often remain miserable because they had never learned what those authentic needs actually were. The fourth medicine addressed the fear that pain and suffering were unbearable obstacles to human happiness. Epicurus's analysis of pain distinguished between acute physical discomfort that was typically brief and manageable, and chronic psychological disturbance that resulted primarily from false beliefs about reality rather than external circumstances. Most of what people considered unbearable suffering was actually artificial anxiety created by misunderstanding their situation, rather than unavoidable consequence of natural limitations. Physical pain, when it occurred, was either brief and intense or chronic and mild. Severe pain rarely lasted long because it typically resulted from acute conditions that either resolved quickly or led to death, while manageable discomfort could be endured indefinitely by people who understood its temporary nature and maintained perspective about its relationship to overall life satisfaction. Psychological suffering, which caused far more human misery than physical pain, usually resulted from confused beliefs about what was necessary for happiness, unrealistic expectations about what life should provide, or false fears about dangers that were either imaginary or beyond individual control. These forms of suffering could be eliminated entirely through clear thinking about reality rather than requiring external changes in circumstances. The integration of these four medicines provided a comprehensive approach to achieving peace of mind that addressed the major sources of human anxiety without requiring supernatural faith, extraordinary external achievements, or withdrawal from ordinary life. Anyone who understood the nature of divinity, mortality, authentic needs, and the relationship between beliefs and suffering could achieve remarkable contentment regardless of their particular circumstances. The tetrapharmakos proved remarkably effective for the students who learned to apply it consistently. Members of the garden reported dramatic improvements in their overall life satisfaction as they internalized these insights and developed practical skills for managing anxiety, appreciating pleasure, and maintaining perspective about the inevitable difficulties of finite existence embedded within natural reality. Perhaps most importantly, this fourfold medicine demonstrated that philosophical wisdom was not merely intellectual luxury for people whose basic needs were already secure, but practical necessity for anyone seeking to make the most of whatever opportunities life might provide. The remedies were accessible to anyone willing to examine their own experience honestly and courageously, regardless of their formal education, economic status, or social position. Chapter 6. The Art of Friendship. Epicurus's analysis of friendship as the highest human pleasure and the foundation of genuine security represented one of his most original contributions to practical philosophy. Unlike romantic love, which often involved jealousy and possessiveness, or family relationships, which were determined by biological accident rather than chosen affinity, friendship was a voluntary association between individuals who appreciated each other's qualities and committed themselves to mutual flourishing. His understanding of friendship was both deeper and more practical than conventional approaches that treated it as pleasant, but ultimately secondary to more serious relationships like marriage or political alliances. Epicurean friendship was simultaneously emotional bond, intellectual partnership, economic cooperation, and spiritual community. Friends shared not only affection and enjoyment, but practical support, philosophical insight, and commitment to each other's long-term welfare and development. The analysis began with recognition that human beings were naturally social creatures who required genuine connection with others to achieve psychological well-being. Isolation and loneliness were not merely unpleasant, but actively harmful to human flourishing, creating chronic anxiety and depression that no individual achievements could compensate for. The need for authentic community was as fundamental as the need for food, shelter, or physical safety. However, Epicurus observed that most social relationships failed to provide the security and satisfaction that genuine community could offer. Conventional associations were typically based on temporary mutual advantage, shared prejudices, or external circumstances, rather than deep understanding and appreciation of each other's authentic qualities. Such relationships often created more anxiety than they resolved because they were inherently unstable and conditional. Genuine friendship, by contrast, was based on mutual recognition between individuals who had achieved sufficient self-understanding to appreciate what they had to offer others and what they needed from community life. Friends chose each other because they enjoyed each other's company, respected each other's character, and shared compatible visions of what constituted a meaningful life. These relationships could provide security precisely because they were not dependent on external circumstances or temporary mutual advantages. The practical development of such friendships required skills that Epicurus analyzed systematically. Learning to be a good friend involved understanding one's own needs and capacities clearly enough to enter relationships honestly, rather than seeking others to fulfill needs they could not meet or to provide qualities one was unwilling to develop independently. It also required developing genuine appreciation for others' unique qualities, rather than treating them as means to one's own satisfaction. The garden served as a laboratory for experimenting with different approaches to friendship and community life. The relationships that developed there demonstrated that authentic intimacy was indeed possible among people who shared philosophical understanding and commitment to each other's flourishing. These friendships proved more durable and satisfying than conventional social bonds because they were based on genuine compatibility rather than external convenience. The economic dimensions of Epicurean friendship were particularly innovative. Friends shared resources according to need and ability, but this sharing was voluntary and joyful rather than compulsory and resentful. The community achieved remarkable prosperity through cooperation rather than competition, demonstrating that mutual aid could be more effective than individual accumulation for providing genuine security. More significantly, these economic arrangements eliminated many of the sources of conflict that typically poisoned human relationships. When basic needs were met through community cooperation, individuals were freed from the anxiety and competitiveness that made authentic friendship difficult in societies based on scarcity and competition. People could appreciate each other's success rather than experiencing it as threats to their own welfare. The intellectual dimensions of friendship proved equally important. Epicurean friends engaged in philosophical discussion not as competitive debate aimed at proving superiority, but as collaborative inquiry aimed at understanding reality more clearly and living more wisely. These conversations deepened both individual understanding and mutual appreciation, creating bonds based on shared commitment to truth and wisdom rather than shared prejudices or mutual ignorance. The emotional aspects of friendship received careful analysis that distinguished between healthy and unhealthy forms of attachment. Genuine love between friends involved appreciation for each other's actual qualities, rather than projection of needs, fantasies, or expectations that the other person could not fulfill. Such love was simultaneously passionate and non-possessive, deep and respectful of individual autonomy. Epicurus's own relationships with his students and companions provided models of how such friendship could work in practice. His correspondence reveals genuine affection and concern for their welfare, combined with respect for their independence and individual development. He offered guidance and support without attempting to control their choices, and he appreciated their contributions to his own understanding, rather than expecting one-sided devotion or intellectual submission. The garden's inclusion of women as full participants in community life reflected Epicurean understanding that authentic friendship was possible between people regardless of gender differences. Traditional Greek society's separation of men and women into different social spheres prevented the development of the kind of comprehensive relationships that could provide complete emotional and intellectual satisfaction. Perhaps most remarkably, the friendships that developed in the garden proved capable of surviving external pressures that destroyed other types of relationships. Political upheavals, economic difficulties, illness, and other challenges strengthened rather than weakened these bonds because they were based on mutual commitment to each other's fundamental welfare, rather than shared dependence on external circumstances. The legacy of Epicurean friendship extended far beyond the garden itself. Students who left to establish communities elsewhere carried with them both theoretical understanding and practical experience of how genuine human connection could provide security and satisfaction that no individual achievement could match. The model of philosophical friendship that Epicurus developed influenced subsequent approaches to community, education, and social organization throughout the ancient world. Most importantly, his analysis demonstrated that the highest human pleasure was indeed accessible to anyone willing to develop the self-understanding and interpersonal skills necessary for authentic relationship. Unlike wealth, status, or other conventional goods that were necessarily limited and therefore sources of competition and conflict, friendship was an unlimited resource that became more abundant through sharing rather than less. Chapter 7. Simple living. The philosophical principle of simple living that Epicurus developed and practiced represented a revolutionary approach to the relationship between material circumstances and psychological well-being. Unlike ascetic traditions that treated physical pleasure as inherently corrupting, or conventional approaches that equated success with accumulation, Epicurean simplicity was based on careful analysis of what human beings actually needed for genuine satisfaction versus what they were taught to want through social conditioning and psychological confusion. The foundation of this approach was a systematic investigation of different categories of desires and their relationships to lasting happiness. This analysis revealed that most human misery resulted not from inability to satisfy authentic needs, but from confusion about what those needs actually were. People who understood the difference between natural and artificial desires could achieve remarkable contentment with modest external resources, while those who remained confused about their genuine requirements would find themselves perpetually dissatisfied regardless of their material achievements. Natural and necessary desires for simple food, basic shelter, companionship, and freedom from pain could be satisfied relatively easily and provided genuine pleasure when fulfilled. A person who was hungry experienced real satisfaction from simple bread. Someone who was tired found genuine pleasure in rest, and individuals who were lonely discovered authentic happiness through meaningful friendship. These basic pleasures were intense, reliable, and available to almost everyone regardless of their economic circumstances. Natural but unnecessary desires for luxury foods, elaborate housing, sexual variety, or recognition beyond what was needed for security could provide legitimate enjoyment when available but became sources of suffering when pursued compulsively or when their absence was experienced as deprivation. The key was learning to appreciate such pleasures when they were naturally available without depending on them for happiness or working anxiously to acquire them when they were not accessible. Empty desires that were artificially created by social pressure, advertising, or psychological confusion for immortality, unlimited wealth, or fame that would outlast death could never be satisfied because their objects were either impossible or inherently meaningless. People who organized their lives around such goals guaranteed their own misery because they were pursuing things that could not provide the satisfaction they promised, even if they could be achieved. The practical application of these insights led to a lifestyle that appeared austere to conventional observers, but provided remarkable satisfaction to those who understood its philosophical foundations. Epicurus and his companions ate simple foods, wore plain clothing, lived in modest quarters, and avoided luxury goods that were expensive to acquire and anxiety-provoking to maintain. But this simplicity was not sacrifice. It was intelligent strategy for maximizing genuine pleasure while minimizing unnecessary complications. Simple foods, when eaten by people who were genuinely hungry, provided more intense satisfaction than elaborate meals consumed by those whose appetites were dulled by excess or artificial stimulation. Basic clothing that was comfortable and appropriate for the climate served its natural function without creating the social anxiety that accompanied fashion competition or the economic stress that resulted from expensive consumption. The economic advantages of simple living were considerable. By reducing their need for expensive possessions, the members of the garden achieved remarkable independence from the economic anxieties that dominated most people's lives. They were less vulnerable to financial reversals, political upheavals, or social changes that might affect their access to luxury goods or high-status positions. More importantly, simple living freed time and energy for activities that provided more lasting satisfaction than material accumulation. Instead of working long hours to afford unnecessary purchases, individuals could focus on developing friendships, pursuing intellectual interests, appreciating natural beauty, and engaging in creative activities that contributed to psychological well-being rather than external appearance. The psychological benefits of simplicity proved even more significant than the economic ones. People who learned to find satisfaction in simple pleasures became immune to many of the anxieties that made conventional success stressful rather than satisfying. They were less affected by social comparisons that made others feel inadequate, less vulnerable to advertising that promised happiness through consumption, and less dependent on external circumstances for their sense of self-worth. This inner security enabled them to be more generous with others because their own needs were easily satisfied and therefore not threatened by others' good fortune. Simple living was compatible with genuine charity and mutual aid in ways that luxury consumption was not, because people who needed little for themselves could afford to share freely with those who needed help meeting their basic requirements. The garden's practice of simple living also served important social and political functions. By demonstrating that genuine satisfaction was possible without wealth or status, the community challenged social arrangements that justified inequality through claims that luxury was necessary for happiness. The contentment of the garden's members suggested that much social conflict resulted from artificial scarcity rather than genuine shortage of what people actually needed for well-being. The simplicity was not uniform or rigid, but adapted to individual needs and circumstances. Some members had greater requirements for solitude, others for social interaction. Some needed more physical comfort, others preferred more challenging conditions. The goal was not to impose identical lifestyles, but to help each person discover their own authentic needs and develop practical strategies for meeting those needs efficiently and sustainably. Perhaps most importantly, Epicurean simple living was not withdrawal from life, but engagement with what was most valuable in life. By eliminating the distractions and anxieties that came with pursuing unnecessary luxuries, individuals could focus their attention on the experiences and relationships that provided the deepest satisfaction. Simplicity was a means to fuller living rather than an end in itself. The approach proved remarkably practical for people in diverse circumstances. Wealthy individuals who adopted Epicurean principles found that they could enjoy their resources more fully by using them to support genuine needs rather than artificial ones. People with modest means discovered that they could achieve happiness without requiring external changes in their economic situation. Even those in difficult circumstances could find satisfaction through understanding and pursuing what was actually possible for them rather than lamenting what was not available. Chapter 8. Politics and Withdrawal. Epicurus's famous counsel to live unnoticed and withdraw from political involvement represented one of the most controversial aspects of his philosophy, challenging fundamental assumptions about civic duty, public service, and the relationship between individual welfare and collective responsibility that had dominated Greek thought since the classical period. His position was based not on indifference to social justice or selfish individualism, but on careful analysis of whether political engagement actually served human flourishing or created unnecessary suffering for both participants and the broader community. The historical context for this analysis was crucial. Epicurus lived during a period when traditional city-state democracy was being replaced by imperial autocracy, when military conquest and political intrigue dominated public life, and when individual citizens had little genuine influence on policy decisions that affected their lives. The political arena had become a theater for competitive ego assertion rather than collaborative problem solving, creating chronic anxiety for participants without producing significant improvements in social welfare. His observations of political figures in Athens and other Greek cities convinced him that public involvement typically corrupted rather than fulfilled human potential. Politicians spent their time managing enemies and competitors rather than pursuing activities that provided genuine satisfaction. The pursuit of power required compromising one's authentic convictions to appeal to popular prejudices, manipulating others through rhetoric rather than honest communication, and accepting responsibility for decisions that served institutional interests rather than individual or collective flourishing. Moreover, the psychological costs of political engagement seemed to outweigh any potential benefits for both individuals and society. Political figures lived in constant anxiety about electoral outcomes, policy failures, and personal attacks from opponents. This chronic stress prevented them from developing the inner peace and clear thinking that were necessary for wise decision-making, creating a cycle in which anxious leaders made poor choices that increased rather than decreased social problems. The alternative that Epicurus proposed was not passive withdrawal from all social responsibility, but strategic focus on forms of community engagement that could actually contribute to human welfare. Instead of seeking to reform political institutions from within, individuals could create alternative communities that demonstrated practical approaches to organization based on mutual aid, rational decision-making, and genuine concern for each other's flourishing. The garden itself served as a model for this approach. Rather than trying to convince the Athenian assembly to adopt Epicurean principles through political rhetoric, the community simply embodied those principles in daily practice and allowed the results to speak for themselves. People who observed the contentment, cooperation, and productivity of the garden could draw their own conclusions about whether these methods might be applicable to their own situations. This strategy proved remarkably effective for spreading Epicurean ideas throughout the Greek world. Students who had experienced authentic community in the garden returned to their home cities and established similar communities that attracted others who were dissatisfied with conventional social arrangements. This organic expansion of Epicurean influence occurred without political campaigns, ideological conflicts, or attempts to impose new arrangements on unwilling participants. The withdrawal from politics also protected the philosophical community from the persecution that often befell individuals and groups who challenged established authorities directly. By focusing on private life and voluntary associations, rather than public policy and political institutions, Epicureans could pursue their alternative approaches to living without appearing to threaten existing power structures or competing for control of governmental resources. However, Epicurus's position was not complete isolation from public concerns. Members of the garden participated in economic activity, maintained friendships with people outside the community, and provided assistance to those who sought their help with personal problems. The withdrawal was specifically from competitive political involvement rather than from all forms of social engagement. The analysis also included sophisticated understanding of how political institutions could be reformed if such reform became possible. Epicurean principles suggested that the best government would be one that provided security for its citizens while allowing maximum freedom for voluntary association and individual development. Such government would focus on preventing violence and fraud rather than promoting particular visions of the good life, and would be organized to serve human needs rather than institutional interests or ideological commitments. But Epicurus believed that meaningful political reform was unlikely to occur until larger numbers of people had developed the self-understanding and interpersonal skills necessary for constructive cooperation. Political institutions reflected the psychological maturity of their participants, and attempts to create better institutions without improving individual character were likely to reproduce existing problems in new forms. The emphasis on personal development as the foundation for social improvement was thus not escape from social responsibility, but recognition of what kinds of changes were actually possible and effective. Individuals who had achieved inner peace and learned to maintain satisfying relationships could contribute far more to community welfare than politically engaged people who remain anxious, competitive, and confused about their own and others' genuine needs. Contemporary critics attacked Epicurean withdrawal as selfish indifference to justice and social welfare, but this criticism missed the constructive aspects of the alternative approach. The communities that Epicureans established provided practical demonstrations of more cooperative and satisfying ways of organizing human relationships, offered refuge and support for people who were damaged by conventional social arrangements, and preserved philosophical insights that could contribute to social improvement when circumstances became more favorable for their application. The long-term influence of Epicurean political thought proved significant for the development of liberal democratic theory, particularly the emphasis on individual rights, limited government, and voluntary association as alternatives to authoritarian collectivism or anarchistic individualism. The insight that political institutions should serve human flourishing rather than abstract ideological commitments remains relevant for contemporary discussions about the proper relationship between individual freedom and social responsibility. Perhaps most importantly, Epicurean political analysis demonstrated that meaningful social change often begins with individuals and small communities who develop alternative approaches to living, rather than with direct attempts to reform existing institutions through political action. The garden's influence on subsequent intellectual and social development suggests that living unnoticed can sometimes contribute more to long-term social progress than high-profile political engagement that attracts attention but produces little lasting change. Chapter 9. The Challenge of Pain. Epicurus's analysis of pain and suffering represented one of the most challenging aspects of his philosophical system because it required addressing the obvious fact that life included unavoidable physical discomfort, emotional loss, and existential difficulties that seemed to contradict his claims about the possibility of achieving lasting happiness through philosophical understanding. His approach to these challenges was characteristically empirical, based on careful observation of different types of pain and their relationships to overall life satisfaction, rather than abstract theoretical claims about the ultimate meaning or value of suffering. The foundation of his analysis was the distinction between physical pain that resulted from genuine bodily harm or dysfunction and psychological suffering that was created by false beliefs about reality, unrealistic expectations about what life should provide, or confusion about what was actually necessary for well-being. This distinction was crucial because it revealed that much of what people experienced as unbearable suffering was actually artificial anxiety that could be eliminated through clear thinking rather than unavoidable consequence of natural limitations. Physical pain, when it occurred, followed predictable patterns that made it manageable for people who understood its nature. Acute pain was typically brief because it resulted from conditions that either resolved quickly or led to death, while chronic pain was usually mild enough to allow for satisfying activities when properly managed. Severe pain that lasted indefinitely was relatively rare and usually indicated serious medical conditions that required treatment rather than philosophical acceptance. More importantly, physical discomfort could coexist with overall life satisfaction when people understood its temporary nature and maintained perspective about its relationship to their broader circumstances and goals. Someone who was experiencing pain from injury or illness could still appreciate friendship, intellectual activity, natural beauty, and other pleasures that remained available despite physical limitations. The psychological dimensions of pain proved far more significant for understanding human suffering, because emotional disturbance typically created more lasting misery than physical discomfort. Fear, anxiety, anger, jealousy, and depression could poison entire lifetimes in ways that physical pain rarely did, and these psychological states usually resulted from confused thinking rather than external circumstances that could not be changed. Epicurus identified several categories of psychological suffering that could be addressed through philosophical analysis and practical wisdom. Existential anxiety about the meaning and purpose of life often resulted from false beliefs about cosmic purpose or divine plans that human beings were supposed to fulfill. Once people understood that they were natural phenomena embedded with the natural reality without supernatural obligations, they could focus on creating meaning through their own choices and relationships rather than worrying about whether they were fulfilling external purposes. Social anxiety about status, recognition, and competitive success reflected confusion about what was actually necessary for security and satisfaction. People who understood that genuine needs could be met relatively easily were freed from the chronic stress that came from trying to achieve impossible goals or maintain artificial superiority over others. They could appreciate their actual achievements without needing constant external validation. Interpersonal suffering that resulted from romantic disappointments, family conflicts, or friendship problems often involved unrealistic expectations about what other people could provide, or controlling attitudes that prevented authentic intimacy. Learning to appreciate others' actual qualities while accepting their limitations and autonomy made relationships sources of satisfaction rather than chronic frustration. The fear of future suffering often created more immediate misery than actual difficulties when they occurred. People who spent years worrying about potential problems that might never occur, or who made themselves miserable anticipating pain that might be manageable when it actually happened, multiplied their suffering unnecessarily through anxious projection rather than focusing on present opportunities for satisfaction. Perhaps most significantly, much psychological suffering resulted from resistance to circumstances that could not be changed rather than from the circumstances themselves. Death, aging, natural disasters, and other inevitable aspects of finite existence became sources of chronic anguish when people refused to accept them as natural features of life that could be faced with dignity rather than tragic injustices that made existence meaningless. The practical approaches that Epicurus developed for managing pain drew on both philosophical understanding and empirical experimentation. Physical discomfort could often be reduced through appropriate medical treatment, lifestyle modifications, and attention to diet, exercise, and environmental conditions. But even when such measures were insufficient, pain could be made bearable through mental techniques that focused attention on available pleasures rather than unavoidable difficulties. Psychological suffering responded even better to philosophical intervention because it was usually based on correctable errors in thinking rather than unchangeable external circumstances. People who learned to examine their beliefs about what was necessary for happiness often discovered that their anxiety was based on pursuing impossible goals or fearing imaginary dangers rather than responding to genuine threats or limitations. The garden provided a supportive environment for people who were learning to apply these insights to their own experience of pain and difficulty. Community members could offer practical assistance during periods of illness or crisis, while providing emotional support that made temporary suffering more bearable. The presence of others who had successfully applied Epicurean principles to their own challenges provided both encouragement and practical guidance. Epicurus's own experience of chronic illness during his later years provided a test case for his theoretical insights about pain management. His letters from this period reveal remarkable equanimity despite significant physical discomfort, suggesting that his philosophical understanding had indeed provided practical resources for maintaining life satisfaction even under difficult circumstances. The approach to pain that he developed influenced subsequent philosophical and medical traditions that emphasized the importance of psychological factors in physical health and the possibility of reducing suffering through appropriate understanding of its nature and causes. Contemporary research in pain management, cognitive therapy, and psychosomatic medicine has confirmed many of his insights about the relationship between beliefs, emotions, and the subjective experience of physical discomfort. Most importantly, his analysis demonstrated that acknowledging the reality of pain and suffering did not require abandoning hope for genuine happiness or accepting pessimistic conclusions about the ultimate meaninglessness of human existence. Physical and emotional difficulties were natural aspects of finite life that could be faced with wisdom and courage, rather than obstacles that made authentic satisfaction impossible. Chapter 10. Letters to Friends. The correspondence that Epicurus maintained with students and companions throughout his mature life provides intimate insight into how his philosophical principles translated into personal relationships and practical guidance for people facing the ordinary challenges of human existence. Unlike formal treatises written for public audiences, these letters reveal the warmth, humor, and genuine care that characterized his approach to friendship and teaching, demonstrating that philosophical wisdom could enhance rather than replace emotional connection and practical support. The letters show Epicurus engaging with specific individuals who had particular needs, circumstances, and personalities, rather than offering abstract advice for generic human problems. He wrote to Menicius about managing anxiety during political upheaval, to Hermarchus about maintaining intellectual independence while respecting legitimate authority, to Leontian about balancing personal relationships with philosophical commitments, and to many others who sought guidance about questions that combined theoretical understanding with practical application. This individualized approach reflected his conviction that philosophical insights were only valuable to the extent that they helped particular people live better lives in their specific circumstances. While the general principles of pleasure, friendship, and simple living could be universally applied, their concrete implementation needed to be adapted to individual temperaments, abilities, and situations. Effective philosophical guidance required understanding people as unique individuals rather than treating them as representatives of abstract categories. The tone of the letters is remarkably informal and affectionate, revealing relationships based on genuine mutual care rather than hierarchical authority or intellectual competition. Epicurus often began with expressions of concern for his correspondents' health and well-being, shared details about his own daily activities and reflections, and concluded with warm wishes for their happiness and success. These personal elements were not mere courtesy, but integral aspects of philosophical friendship that treated individuals as whole persons rather than disembodied minds. Many letters address practical questions about implementing Epicurean principles in circumstances that were less than ideal for philosophical living. Correspondents wrote about family conflicts that made simple living difficult, economic pressures that required uncomfortable compromises, social obligations that conflicted with withdrawal from public involvement, and health problems that interfered with the pursuit of pleasure and peace of mind. Epicurus's responses to these challenges reveal sophisticated understanding of the difference between philosophical ideals and practical possibilities, and willingness to modify theoretical prescriptions when rigid application might cause more harm than benefit. He encouraged correspondents to make the best choices available within their actual circumstances, rather than torturing themselves about their inability to achieve perfect consistency with philosophical principles. For example, when asked about appropriate responses to economic necessity that might require accepting employment that was not intrinsically satisfying, he suggested focusing on aspects of any work that could provide genuine pleasure, social relationships, opportunities for learning, or contributions to community welfare while maintaining inner independence from external measures of success or failure. When correspondents faced family relationships that included conflict or obligation, he advised finding ways to fulfill reasonable duties while protecting one's inner peace and authentic commitments. This might involve accepting compromise in external behavior while maintaining clarity about one's own values and priorities, or gradually establishing boundaries that allowed for both family loyalty and individual authenticity. The letters also reveal Epicurus's approach to providing comfort and support during periods of illness, loss, and other forms of unavoidable suffering. His responses demonstrate remarkable sensitivity to the emotional needs of people in pain, while maintaining the philosophical perspective that could help them find meaning and even satisfaction despite difficult circumstances. When Pythicles was struggling with the death of his father, Epicurus acknowledged the reality of grief, while pointing out that the love that made loss painful was itself a source of happiness that justified its own risks. The capacity to care deeply about others was one of life's greatest pleasures, and this capacity necessarily involved vulnerability to loss that was the price of authentic connection rather than a reason to avoid relationships. When Idomeneus was facing financial difficulties that threatened his family's security, Epicurus offered both practical assistance and philosophical perspective about the relationship between external circumstances and internal well-being. Material poverty could make life more difficult, but it could not prevent the fundamental satisfactions that came from friendship, intellectual activity, and appreciation of simple pleasures that remained available regardless of economic status. Perhaps most remarkably, the letters demonstrate that philosophical friendship could provide security and support that was more reliable than conventional social relationships based on family obligation, economic interest, or political alliance. Epicurus maintained correspondence with former students for decades, offering continuing guidance and encouragement as they faced new challenges and opportunities throughout their lives. The practical advice in the letters covers an extraordinary range of human concerns: child rearing approaches that balanced affection with wisdom, strategies for maintaining health through attention to diet and exercise, methods for managing difficult emotions without suppressing them inappropriately, techniques for finding satisfaction in necessary work that was not intrinsically enjoyable, and approaches to aging and mortality that maintain dignity while accepting natural limitations. The overall impression from this correspondence is of philosophical principles that had become so thoroughly integrated into Epicurus's personality and daily habits that he could apply them spontaneously and appropriately to whatever circumstances arose, without rigid adherence to abstract formulas or defensive insistence on theoretical consistency at the expense of practical wisdom. The letters thus provide evidence that Epicurean philosophy was indeed capable of supporting genuine human flourishing across a wide range of circumstances and over extended periods of time. The friendships that these letters both document and embody demonstrate that philosophical understanding could deepen rather than replace emotional connection, and that intellectual wisdom could enhance rather than compromise practical effectiveness in meeting life's ordinary challenges and opportunities. Most significantly, the correspondence reveals that the philosophical life need not involve withdrawal from human connection or indifference to others' welfare, but could instead provide foundation for relationships that were more satisfying and more supportive than conventional social bonds, because they were based on genuine understanding and mutual care, rather than external convenience or obligation. Chapter 11. The wisdom of limits. As Epicurus entered his 60s, his philosophical understanding deepened through direct experience of the physical limitations, social losses, and existential challenges that accompanied aging in the ancient world. Rather than treating these developments as tragic defeats that undermined his philosophical claims about happiness, he approached them as opportunities for testing and refining his insights about pleasure, acceptance, and the relationship between external circumstances and inner peace. The physical changes that came with age provided particularly valuable laboratories for examining his theories about pain and the management of unavoidable discomfort. Chronic illness, reduced energy, and decreased mobility challenged his ability to maintain the active lifestyle that had characterized his earlier years, but they also offered opportunities for discovering forms of satisfaction that were less dependent on physical capacity and more reliant on mental discipline and emotional wisdom. His correspondence during this period reveals remarkable consistency between his philosophical teachings and his personal practice. Instead of raging against natural limitations or desperately seeking remedies that might restore his former capabilities, he accepted declining health with the same rational equanimity that he had applied to earlier challenges like social ostracism and economic uncertainty. Physical discomfort was simply another natural phenomenon that could be understood, managed appropriately, and integrated into overall life satisfaction, rather than allowing it to destroy peace of mind. This acceptance was not passive resignation, but active adaptation that focused energy on activities and relationships that remained possible, while gradually releasing attachment to those that were no longer available. He continued his intellectual work, but adjusted his schedule and methods to accommodate reduced stamina and frequent periods of pain. He maintained his friendships, but relied more heavily on correspondence than face-to-face interaction when physical presence became difficult. Perhaps most importantly, his experience of limitation provided new insights into the nature of pleasure itself. As some sources of enjoyment became less accessible, others revealed deeper satisfaction than he had previously recognized. The simple pleasure of consciousness itself, the remarkable fact of awareness within natural reality, became more vivid when contrasted with the approaching prospect of its cessation. The companionship of long-term friends took on enhanced meaning as he became more aware of its temporary nature. Conversations that he might once have taken for granted became precious opportunities for connection that deserved complete attention and appreciation. The loyalty and care that friends provided during periods of illness demonstrated the practical value of the philosophical friendship he had advocated throughout his teaching career. His approach to the prospect of death reflected the same rational analysis that he had applied to theoretical discussions of mortality during his earlier years. Death remained what it had always been: the natural dissolution of the atomic structures that temporarily constituted individual consciousness, but his direct confrontation with this reality provided empirical confirmation of his theoretical insights about its psychological manageability. The fear of death that dominated most people's experience of aging proved to be largely artificial anxiety based on conceptual confusion rather than appropriate response to genuine threat. Since consciousness required the continuation of specific material arrangements, death necessarily involved cessation of all experience, making it impossible to be harmed by being dead. The process of dying might involve discomfort, but the state of death itself could not cause suffering. This understanding enabled him to face his mortality with remarkable serenity that impressed even critics of his philosophy. The peace of mind that his theoretical analysis had promised proved achievable in practice when tested under the most challenging circumstances that finite existence could provide. His example demonstrated that philosophical wisdom was not merely intellectual sophistication, but practical knowledge that could support genuine well-being under any conditions. The social losses that accompanied aging provided additional opportunities for examining his insights about attachment, grief, and the relationship between love and loss. Death and distance gradually separated him from companions who had shared his journey from the early days of the garden through decades of intellectual and emotional development. These losses caused real pain that he acknowledged honestly rather than attempting to minimize through philosophical denial. But the grief he experienced validated rather than contradicted his analysis of friendship as life's highest pleasure. The capacity to mourn deeply demonstrated the authenticity of the relationships that made loss painful, and this authenticity justified the vulnerability that made suffering possible. A life that avoided the risk of loss by avoiding deep connection would be far less satisfying than one that embraced both the joys and sorrows that came with genuine caring. His understanding of time and memory also evolved through the experience of having accumulated decades of experiences that could be recalled and appreciated even when their original circumstances were no longer available. The pleasures of the past were not lost simply because they were over. They remained accessible through memory and had contributed to the development of wisdom and perspective that enriched present experience. This temporal perspective provided resources for maintaining satisfaction even when present circumstances were less than ideal. Someone who had experienced genuine friendship, intellectual discovery, and simple pleasures retained access to these experiences through memory and understanding, while also possessing enhanced capacity for appreciating whatever opportunities remained available. The final years of his life thus became a capstone demonstration of Epicurean principles, rather than a period of decline that undermined earlier achievements. His ability to maintain inner peace, continue intellectual work, and provide guidance to others, despite significant physical limitations, proved that authentic philosophical wisdom could indeed support human flourishing under any circumstances that natural necessity might impose. The example he provided influenced not only his immediate students, but subsequent generations of thinkers who sought practical approaches to aging, illness, and mortality that combined honest acknowledgement of limitation with sustained commitment to whatever satisfaction remained possible. His demonstration that genuine acceptance of natural necessity was compatible with continued pursuit of pleasure and meaning provided lasting guidance for anyone facing the inevitable challenges of finite existence. Most significantly, his later years confirmed that the philosophical life he had developed and taught was not dependent on particular external circumstances, but represented a fundamental orientation toward reality that could be maintained regardless of what changes and challenges arose. The wisdom of accepting limits while appreciating possibilities proved to be wisdom about the human condition itself rather than advice that applied only to specific situations or life stages. Chapter 12. The Final Teaching. In the last months of his life, as illness made his physical condition increasingly difficult, but his mind remained clear and engaged, Epicurus provided his most profound teaching through the manner in which he faced mortality. His approach to dying demonstrated with perfect consistency the philosophical principles he had developed through decades of reflection and practical application, offering his students and companions a final lesson in how philosophical wisdom could transform even the most challenging human experiences. The pain from kidney stones and other chronic conditions that had troubled him for years intensified during his final period, yet his letters and conversations from this time reveal no trace of bitterness, self-pity, or despair. Instead, he maintained the same analytical curiosity about his experience and genuine concern for others' welfare that had characterized his entire philosophical career. His suffering became another opportunity for understanding the relationship between physical discomfort and psychological well-being rather than a defeat that undermined his philosophical insights. His famous letter to Idomeneus, written on what would prove to be the last day of his life, exemplifies this remarkable integration of philosophical understanding with practical wisdom. On this truly happy day of my life, as I am at the point of death, I write this to you. The diseases in my bladder and stomach are pursuing their course, lacking nothing of their natural severity. But against all this is the joy in my heart at the recollection of my past conversations with you. This statement encapsulates everything essential about Epicurean philosophy in its approach to human limitation and possibility. Physical pain was acknowledged honestly rather than denied or minimized, but it was placed within a larger context that included the fundamental satisfaction that came from genuine friendship and meaningful intellectual work. The joy that accompanied remembrance of philosophical conversation was not less real than physical suffering. Indeed, it was more significant because it connected to the authentic sources of human happiness rather than the temporary circumstances that affected bodily comfort. The letter continued with practical instructions for his friends' welfare and expressions of hope for their future happiness, demonstrating that philosophical acceptance of mortality was compatible with continued commitment to others' flourishing. Someone who had achieved genuine equanimity about death could focus energy on contributing to life rather than becoming absorbed in personal concerns about dying. His ability to maintain intellectual clarity and emotional stability during extreme physical distress provided compelling evidence that the philosophical life he had developed could indeed support human dignity under any circumstances. The peace of mind that his theories had promised proved achievable in practice when tested under conditions that would overwhelm most people's psychological resources. The manner of his death also demonstrated the social dimensions of Epicurean philosophy. Rather than dying in isolation or becoming a burden to others through excessive demands for attention and care, he used his final period to strengthen the relationships that had provided the deepest satisfaction of his life. His concern for his companions' welfare continued until his last conscious moments, proving that genuine selfishness, properly understood, was compatible with authentic generosity and care for others. The garden community's response to his approaching death reflected the practical wisdom they had learned about grief, loss, and the relationship between individual mortality and continuing community life. While acknowledging their personal sorrow about losing someone they loved and respected, they also celebrated the extraordinary life he had lived and the legacy he was leaving through their own understanding and commitment to the principles he had taught. The arrangements he made for continuing the garden's work after his death revealed sophisticated understanding of how philosophical communities could survive the loss of their founders. Instead of trying to establish rigid doctrines or hierarchical authority structures that would preserve his teachings unchanged, he emphasized the importance of maintaining the experimental spirit and practical orientation that had made Epicurean philosophy effective for addressing real human needs. His will provided for the continuing financial support of the garden, while establishing governance structures that distributed authority among several trusted companions, rather than concentrating power in a single successor. This approach reflected his insight that authentic philosophical wisdom could not be transmitted through institutional authority, but required individual understanding and commitment that each person had to develop for themselves. The immediate aftermath of his death confirmed the practical value of the philosophical friendships he had cultivated and the community structures he had established. Instead of fragmenting into competing factions or gradually dissolving due to lack of central leadership, the garden continued to function as an effective philosophical community that attracted new members while maintaining the essential insights and practices that had made it successful. The students who had worked closely with him proved capable of carrying on his teaching methods and philosophical investigations, not through mechanical repetition of his conclusions, but through continued application of his analytical approaches to new questions and circumstances. This organic development of Epicurean philosophy after its founder's death demonstrated that he had succeeded in creating something more valuable than personal intellectual achievement, a tradition of practical wisdom that could adapt and grow while maintaining its essential commitment to human flourishing. The accounts of his death that circulated throughout the ancient world emphasized his extraordinary serenity and continued concern for others, rather than focusing on the physical suffering he endured. These stories contributed to the recognition that philosophical wisdom could indeed provide practical resources for facing life's greatest challenges with dignity and even joy. Perhaps most significantly, his final teaching demonstrated that the philosophical life he had developed was not escape from human limitation, but creative engagement with the full range of experiences that finite existence provided. Death was not defeat but completion, not tragedy, but natural conclusion to the remarkable opportunity of consciousness within natural reality. The example he provided influenced subsequent approaches to mortality, medical ethics, and the relationship between intellectual understanding and practical wisdom throughout the ancient world and beyond. His demonstration that genuine philosophical insight could transform even dying into an expression of human dignity and an affirmation of life's value remains relevant for anyone seeking to understand how wisdom relates to the inevitable challenges and opportunities of finite existence. In the centuries following Epicurus's death in 270 BCE, his philosophical system became one of the dominant intellectual traditions of the Hellenistic world, spreading throughout the Mediterranean region and adapting to diverse cultural contexts while maintaining its essential focus on practical wisdom about achieving peace of mind in uncertain times. The success of Epicurean philosophy during this period reflected both the universal appeal of its central insights and its flexibility in addressing the specific challenges that arose as Greek culture encountered Roman power and other civilizations. The political instability and cultural upheaval that characterized the Hellenistic period created ideal conditions for philosophical approaches that emphasized individual well-being and voluntary community rather than civic duty and political participation. As traditional city-state loyalties became less relevant to people's daily lives, and as individuals found themselves embedded within larger imperial systems that they could neither understand nor influence significantly, the Epicurean focus on friendship, simple living, and rational analysis of desire provided practical guidance that was both achievable and satisfying. The Roman adoption of Epicurean principles proved particularly significant for the tradition's long-term influence. Roman intellectuals and political figures found in Epicurean philosophy resources for maintaining personal integrity and inner peace, despite involvement in the competitive, often brutal world of imperial politics. The emphasis on rational pleasure and emotional equilibrium offered sophisticated alternatives to both Stoic resignation and Cynic withdrawal that were more compatible with Roman values of practical effectiveness and cultural refinement. Lucretius, the great Roman poet and philosopher of the 1st century BC, provided the most systematic and influential presentation of Epicurean thought for Latin-speaking audiences. His poem, A Nature of Things, combined rigorous exposition of atomistic natural philosophy with passionate advocacy for the therapeutic benefits of understanding reality according to rational principles rather than superstitious fears. The work demonstrated that Epicurean insights about pleasure, mortality, and social relationships could be expressed through literary art that was both intellectually sophisticated and emotionally compelling. The Roman development of Epicurean philosophy also revealed its adaptability to different cultural contexts and practical circumstances, while maintaining essential insights about the nature of pleasure and the conditions for human happiness. Roman Epicureans modified certain aspects of the tradition to accommodate their greater involvement in political and economic affairs. They developed more nuanced approaches to public service, military activity, and social responsibility that preserved inner freedom while acknowledging external obligations. The spread of Epicurean communities throughout the ancient world created networks of philosophical friendship that transcended national and cultural boundaries. These communities provided refuge and support for intellectuals, artists, and other individuals who were seeking alternatives to conventional social arrangements, while also serving as centers for the preservation and transmission of philosophical and scientific knowledge. The tradition's emphasis on inclusive community that welcomed women and slaves as full participants continued to challenge conventional social hierarchies throughout the Hellenistic period. Epicurean communities served as experiments in alternative approaches to gender relations, economic cooperation, and social organization that influenced broader cultural developments toward greater recognition of individual dignity and rights. The scientific dimensions of Epicurean philosophy proved equally influential for the development of ancient natural philosophy and medicine. The atomic theory that provided the metaphysical foundation for Epicurean ethics also contributed to more sophisticated understanding of physical phenomena, biological processes, and medical treatment that influenced subsequent scientific traditions throughout antiquity and beyond. Epicurean approaches to pain management, psychological therapy, and the relationship between mind and body contributed to the development of ancient medicine and influenced later therapeutic traditions that emphasized the importance of psychological factors in physical health. The insight that much suffering resulted from false beliefs rather than unavoidable external circumstances provided foundation for therapeutic approaches that combined rational analysis with practical techniques for emotional regulation. The tradition's influence on ancient literary culture extended far beyond explicitly philosophical works to include poetry, drama, and prose that reflected Epicurean themes and values. The appreciation of simple pleasures, the celebration of friendship, the acceptance of mortality, and the critique of conventional ambition appeared in various forms throughout Hellenistic and Roman literature, contributing to cultural developments that emphasized individual experience and authentic relationship over abstract duty and social conformity. Perhaps most significantly, the Hellenistic development of Epicurean philosophy demonstrated the tradition's capacity for organic growth and adaptation while maintaining essential insights about human nature and the conditions for flourishing. Instead of becoming rigid orthodoxy that repeated original formulations without modification, Epicureanism evolved through continued application of its fundamental methodological commitments to new circumstances and challenges. The philosophical communities that preserved and developed Epicurean insights served important social functions during periods of political upheaval and cultural transition. They provided stability and continuity for intellectual traditions, economic support for individuals who were displaced by social changes, and alternative models for community organization that influenced subsequent political and social developments. The persistence of Epicurean philosophy throughout the Hellenistic period, despite periodic persecution and cultural pressure to adopt more politically acceptable alternatives, testified to the practical value that individuals found in its approaches to anxiety, desire, and social relationship. The tradition survived because it continued to provide effective guidance for people seeking genuine happiness and peace of mind, rather than merely theoretical sophistication or cultural prestige. The legacy of Hellenistic Epicureanism thus established foundations for later developments in philosophy, science, politics, and culture that would prove influential throughout Western civilization and eventually beyond. The insights that Epicurus had developed through careful analysis of his own experience and those of his companions proved to have universal relevance that transcended the particular historical circumstances of their origin. Most importantly, the Hellenistic period confirmed that Epicurean philosophy represented more than individual intellectual achievement. It was a practical tradition of wisdom that could be transmitted, adapted, and applied by others who were committed to understanding and promoting human flourishing under whatever circumstances they might encounter. The enduring relevance of Epicurean philosophy across more than 2 millennia of human history testifies to the accuracy of its fundamental insights about human nature, the sources of satisfaction and anxiety, and the practical conditions that support genuine well-being. What began as one man's careful analysis of his own experience and that of his immediate companions has proved to contain principles about consciousness, community, and the good life that transcend particular historical circumstances and cultural contexts. Contemporary psychological research has provided scientific validation for many of Epicurus's empirical observations about the relationship between different types of desires and their contributions to lasting happiness. Studies of hedonic adaptation confirm his insight that pleasures based on external achievements or material acquisitions tend to provide only temporary satisfaction before returning individuals to baseline levels of contentment. Conversely, research on eudaimonic well-being validates his emphasis on meaningful relationships, personal growth, and contribution to others' welfare as sources of more durable satisfaction. Neuroscientific investigations of consciousness and emotion have revealed biological mechanisms that support his philosophical analysis of pleasure and pain as guidance systems that evolved to help organisms navigate their environments effectively. The distinction he drew between natural and artificial desires corresponds to research findings about the difference between intrinsic motivations that emerge from authentic psychological needs and extrinsic motivations that are socially conditioned, but often psychologically harmful. Modern therapeutic approaches to anxiety and depression often employ techniques that reflect Epicurean insights about the relationship between thoughts, emotions, and well-being. Cognitive behavioral therapy's emphasis on examining and modifying dysfunctional beliefs parallels his analysis of how false ideas about reality create unnecessary suffering. Mindfulness-based interventions that focus attention on present experience echo his teaching about finding satisfaction in simple, immediate pleasures, rather than anxious projection into uncertain futures. The contemporary understanding of social relationships and their effects on mental and physical health confirms his analysis of friendship as the highest pleasure and most reliable source of security. Research on social support networks demonstrates that meaningful connections with others provide both psychological benefits and practical assistance that contribute significantly to longevity, immune function, and resilience during stressful periods. Environmental psychology and sustainable living movements have rediscovered the wisdom of his approach to simple living and the distinction between authentic needs and artificially created wants. As contemporary societies grapple with the environmental and psychological costs of consumer culture, Epicurean insights about finding satisfaction through understanding and meeting genuine needs, rather than pursuing endless accumulation, offer both individual and collective guidance for more sustainable approaches to prosperity. The globalization of communication and economic activity has created social conditions that make his emphasis on voluntary community and withdrawal from competitive political involvement increasingly relevant. As traditional sources of identity and meaning become less stable, individuals increasingly seek alternative approaches to community and purpose that prioritize authentic relationship and personal development over conventional markers of success. Political philosophy has been enriched by renewed appreciation for his insights about the relationship between individual well-being and social organization. Contemporary discussions of civil liberties, limited government, and voluntary association often reflect principles that can be traced to Epicurean analysis of how political institutions can support rather than undermine human flourishing. The development of positive psychology as a scientific discipline presents perhaps the most direct contemporary application of Epicurean methodological approaches to understanding happiness and human potential. The field's emphasis on empirical investigation of what actually contributes to well-being, rather than merely theoretical speculation about what should contribute to well-being, directly parallels the approach that Epicurus pioneered in ancient philosophy. Educational applications of Epicurean insights have appeared in programs designed to help students develop emotional intelligence, critical thinking skills, and realistic approaches to goal setting and life satisfaction. The emphasis on understanding one's authentic needs and developing practical strategies for meeting those needs provides valuable guidance for young people facing complex choices about careers, relationships, and lifestyle priorities. Medical and therapeutic applications continue to expand as healthcare providers recognize the importance of psychological factors in physical health and the value of approaches that treat individuals as whole persons rather than collections of symptoms. Epicurean insights about the relationship between mind and body, the nature of pain, and the possibilities for maintaining satisfaction despite physical limitations remain relevant for contemporary discussions of medical ethics and patient care. Perhaps most significantly, the global challenges facing contemporary civilization, climate change, technological disruption, cultural fragmentation, and social inequality acquire the kind of long-term thinking and cooperative action that Epicurean philosophy can support. His insights about distinguishing between genuine needs and artificial wants, about finding security through community rather than accumulation, and about maintaining inner peace while working constructively for positive change offer resources that remain practical and relevant. The integration of ancient wisdom with contemporary knowledge that characterizes the best applications of Epicurean philosophy demonstrates its continued vitality as a living tradition rather than merely historical artifact. Contemporary practitioners adapt his insights to current circumstances while maintaining commitment to his fundamental methodological principles. Empirical investigation of what actually contributes to human flourishing, rational analysis of the relationship between desires and satisfaction, and practical application of philosophical understanding to daily life. The communities and individuals who continue to find guidance in Epicurean philosophy demonstrate its relevance across diverse cultural contexts and personal circumstances. Whether applied to questions of career choice, relationship dynamics, financial planning, health management, or social engagement, the basic principles he developed continue to provide practical wisdom that can enhance both individual well-being and social cooperation. Most importantly, the eternal relevance of Epicurean philosophy lies not in any specific prescriptions about how to live, but in its demonstration that careful attention to one's own experience, combined with rational analysis of that experience and willingness to modify conclusions based on evidence, can provide reliable guidance for achieving genuine satisfaction regardless of external circumstances. This methodological approach to wisdom remains as valuable today as it was in ancient Athens, offering tools for anyone seeking to understand themselves and their world more clearly. 23 centuries after Epicurus planted his garden on the outskirts of Athens, the seeds of wisdom he cultivated there continue to flourish in countless lives transformed by his insights about pleasure, friendship, and the art of living well. What began as a small community of seekers sharing simple meals and profound conversations has become one of humanity's most enduring contributions to the understanding of happiness and the conditions that make authentic human flourishing possible. The academic institutionalization of his ideas through university philosophy programs ensures that future generations encounter systematic approaches to the analysis of desire, pleasure, and human motivation as legitimate subjects for rigorous investigation. Contemporary students discover that the questions he asked about what constitutes genuine satisfaction remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Athens, and that the methods he developed for addressing these questions continue to yield insights that can improve the quality of human experience. The therapeutic applications of Epicurean psychology have proved particularly valuable in contemporary approaches to mental health that emphasize the relationship between thoughts, emotions, and well-being. Cognitive behavioral therapy, positive psychology, and mindfulness-based interventions all reflect insights that he developed through careful observation of consciousness and its responses to different types of experiences and beliefs. Perhaps most significantly, his demonstration that philosophical wisdom could be simultaneously intellectually rigorous and practically accessible has inspired countless individuals who might otherwise have dismissed philosophical reflection as irrelevant to ordinary concerns. His integration of sophisticated analysis with genuine warmth and concern for human welfare provides a model for how intellectual work can serve life rather than becoming an escape from it. The environmental movement has found in his teaching about simple living and the distinction between natural and artificial needs a philosophical foundation for sustainable approaches to prosperity that recognize ecological limits, while affirming human capacity for satisfaction and creativity. His insight that genuine wealth consists in understanding and meeting authentic needs, rather than accumulating unlimited possessions, offers guidance for addressing contemporary challenges that require both individual behavior change and collective policy development. Community organizers and social activists have discovered in his approach to voluntary association and mutual aid practical alternatives to both competitive individualism and authoritarian collectivism. The Garden's example of inclusive community based on philosophical understanding and mutual care continues to inspire experiments in intentional community, cooperative economics, and alternative approaches to education and social organization. Mental health professionals have incorporated his insights about the relationship between acceptance and change, individual development and social support, rational analysis, and emotional wisdom into therapeutic approaches that help people develop greater resilience and life satisfaction. His understanding that much psychological suffering results from confused thinking rather than unchangeable circumstances has proved particularly valuable for treating anxiety, depression, and other conditions that involve distorted relationships with reality. Educational innovators have applied Epicurean principles to develop curricula and pedagogical methods that emphasize critical thinking, emotional intelligence, and practical wisdom alongside traditional academic content. The insight that genuine learning must be tested through application to lived experience rather than merely absorbed as abstract information continues to influence progressive approaches to education at all levels. The globalization of his ideas through translation and cultural adaptation has created international networks of individuals and communities committed to the practical application of philosophical wisdom to contemporary challenges. These networks facilitate sharing of insights and strategies for implementing Epicurean principles in diverse cultural contexts while maintaining the tradition's essential commitment to human flourishing. Contemporary research in positive psychology and well-being studies has provided scientific validation for many of his empirical observations about the sources of satisfaction and the conditions that support human thriving. This convergence of ancient wisdom with modern knowledge demonstrates that careful attention to experience, combined with rational analysis of what actually works to promote happiness, can yield insights that transcend particular historical periods and cultural contexts. Digital technology and global communication have created new possibilities for the kinds of philosophical friendship that he identified as life's highest pleasure. Online communities dedicated to Epicurean principles provide support and guidance for individuals seeking to apply ancient wisdom to contemporary circumstances, while preserving and developing the tradition through collaborative inquiry and mutual encouragement. The business world has begun to recognize the practical value of his insights about motivation, satisfaction, and the relationship between individual well-being and organizational effectiveness. Management approaches that emphasize employee development, work-life balance, and intrinsic, rather than merely extrinsic rewards reflect principles that can be traced to his analysis of what actually motivates human beings to excel and find satisfaction in their activities. Political movements that emphasize individual rights, voluntary association, and limited government often reflect his insights about the proper relationship between individual flourishing and social organization, even when they do not explicitly acknowledge this philosophical heritage. His analysis of how political institutions can support rather than undermine authentic community remains relevant for contemporary discussions of democracy, civil liberties, and social policy. Most importantly, the continuing appeal of his approach to living demonstrates that the fundamental human questions he addressed, how can we be happy? What do we really need? How should we treat each other? Remain as urgent and challenging today as they were in ancient times. The methods he developed for addressing these questions through careful observation, rational analysis, and practical experimentation continue to provide valuable guidance for anyone seeking authentic wisdom about how to live well. The garden he planted has indeed proved perennial, its spring eternal, its fruits available to anyone willing to cultivate the soil of their own experience with the patience, intelligence, and care that genuine wisdom requires. In learning to distinguish between our authentic needs and our artificial wants, in developing the capacity for genuine friendship and mutual aid, in finding profound pleasure in simple experiences of consciousness and connection. We participate in the same timeless human project that occupied Epicurus and his companions as they shared their meals, their insights, and their commitment to the flourishing of conscious beings embedded within the magnificent, challenging, utterly natural reality that contains us all. The olive tree beneath which Epicurus sat with his friends has long since returned to the earth that nourished it, but something of its shade persists wherever human beings gather to share simple pleasures and profound conversation. The garden that once flourished on the outskirts of Athens exists now only in archaeological traces and historical memory. Yet, its essential spirit continues to bloom in countless lives touched by the recognition that genuine happiness is both possible and surprisingly accessible to anyone willing to understand what they actually need for contentment. We cannot know what thoughts occupied Epicurus in his final moments. Whether the peace he had discovered through decades of philosophical investigation provided comfort as consciousness prepared to return to the atomic dance from which it had temporarily emerged, but the serenity with which he faced every previous challenge suggests that he met death as he had met life, with clear sight, rational acceptance, and persistent appreciation for the remarkable fact that awareness was possible at all within natural reality. What remains most extraordinary about his achievement is not any particular theoretical conclusion, but his demonstration that careful attention to experience, combined with honest analysis and practical application, could indeed provide reliable guidance for living well under any circumstances. He proved that the highest philosophical wisdom was not escape from ordinary human concerns, but deeper engagement with the fundamental questions that everyone faces. What will make me truly happy? How should I relate to others? What deserves my time and energy? How can I maintain inner peace in an uncertain world? The answers he discovered were as simple as they were revolutionary. True happiness comes from understanding and satisfying our genuine needs, rather than chasing artificial desires manufactured by social pressure or internal confusion. Authentic relationships require mutual appreciation and commitment to each other's flourishing rather than possessiveness or competition. Inner peace emerges from accepting what cannot be changed while focusing energy on what remains within our power to influence. The deepest pleasures are often the simplest ones, available to anyone willing to pay attention to the present moment rather than anxiously projecting into an imaginary future or nostalgically dwelling on an irretrievable past. The feast he shared with his friends continues in every gathering where people appreciate each other's company, support each other's growth, and find satisfaction in simple pleasures that require no external validation or elaborate preparation. The bread, olives, and water that nourished his community remain available to us in whatever forms our circumstances provide, carrying the same potential for genuine satisfaction when received with gratitude rather than taken for granted. The conversations that flourished in his garden persist in every exchange where people seek to understand themselves and their world more clearly, to help each other navigate life's challenges with greater wisdom, and to create together the kinds of relationships and communities that actually support human flourishing, rather than merely satisfying conventional expectations or serving institutional interests. Perhaps most importantly, his example continues to demonstrate that philosophical wisdom need not be the privilege of those with abundant leisure or exceptional intellectual gifts, but represents a way of approaching experience that can enhance any life willing to embrace it. The questions he asked can be asked by anyone. The methods he used for finding answers can be applied to any circumstances. The peace he achieved remains accessible to anyone willing to undertake the patient work of understanding their own nature and situation clearly. The atomic particles that once constituted his consciousness have long since been reorganized into countless other forms, but the patterns of thought and feeling that made him who he was continue to influence the world through everyone who has learned to find profound pleasure in simple experiences, lasting security in genuine friendship, and perfect freedom through understanding and accepting the natural necessities that govern all existence. In this sense, the garden remains an eternal spring, its wisdom perpetually renewable, its essential teachings as fresh and nourishing today as they were when first shared beneath the olive trees of ancient Athens. The simple feast continues, and we are all invited to participate, bringing only our authentic hunger and our willingness to receive whatever genuine nourishment life provides when we finally understand what we actually need for satisfaction. The invitation remains open, the table is always prepared, and the conversation that began with Epicurus and his friends awaits our own contributions to humanity's ongoing inquiry into the art of living well.